Hey guys and girls, today we're gonna look at life cycle hooks in React. Just like in life, you're born and you learn some skills, you get a job, you get married, you retire, and then you die. Components go through also a life cycle. They're born and they die also, and in between they go through certain things. And if you want to do specific things, like for example, if you want to make an AJAX call, when exactly do you make it in the life of a component? If you want to change state, when do you do it? So these hooks are nothing but methods where you can do appropriate things. And so we're going to look at what can you do with each hooks and when they are called and why they are called. So we can control things very smoothly, and they're very important to learn if you want to React, because you can't just call things anywhere. You need to make sure that you do it in the right hook. By the way, this is a part of a much larger series on React, and if you're not following it, I'll provide a link to the playlist so you can check it out. And welcome to techsith Tutorials. Alright, so to begin with, I have created a project using create React app. I'm inside the app.js, and here all I have is simple render function. App is my main component. So what we're going to do, we're going to write our lifecycle hooks here. When you create a component, the first thing that runs is actually constructor. So let's write a constructor here. And when you write a constructor, you have to have super. I'm just going to say console log. I'm just going to print out the constructor so we can look at exactly when it's running. In the life cycle of a component, there are three things. The first thing is initial render. So when you create a component, component will go through the first time it renders. The second thing is if you change something like a state or a prop or something, the component will re-render itself based on the change that you have made. So that is a second kind of a list of lifecycle hooks that we're going to look at it. And the third thing is when you destroy the component, what would happen. So here we're going to look at the initial render, and the constructor only runs one time and only runs when it initially renders. This is actually a good place to set the initial state. And so I can simply say this dot state equal to John. However, you can also write this outside the constructor, state equal to, and name, and I can call it Peter here. So we would know which one really runs first. Inside here, if I just simply do this, this dot state dot name, the one that runs a second would override it. So John gets render. That means that this runs first, and then this runs. We're gonna just remove this. Usually I try to put the state here, not inside the constructor, but it's your personal choice. But we're gonna keep the state inside the constructor for now. After the constructor, there is another method that runs, which call componentWillMount. Remember, the component hasn't mounted yet. If I just simply console log inside, and I would say componentWillMount, and we can look at it in which the constructor runs first and then componentWillMount runs second. Alright, so what can you do in componentWillMount? You have already run the constructor, but the render hasn't happened yet. You have the state and initial prop. You can actually change the state. So you can do set state in componentWillMount. Why would you do that? Why would you set state even after setting up the initial state in the constructor? Well, sometime based on the props, you want to change the state. And this would be an ideal place to do it because the component hasn't been rendered. So if I change the state right now, the component is not going to re-render itself. because it hasn't rendered, because you're going to the first initial state. Also, componentWillMount only runs once, and that is during the initial render. So what else can you do it? So if you want to do something with the global events like a window or document, you can set it here if you want to. So let's do that. Window dot, let's say inner width. Let's say if it's less than 500, then I want to set this into a state. So I can say dot set state inner width equal to window dot inner width. Print that value here. So I can say this dot state dot inner width. So we can look at it. I'm just gonna pipe it here in between. So width, and this should be. So now if I look at it, well, nothing prints here. That is because my window is still greater than 500 pixel. So to see it, if I just squeeze my window, and then I have to reload it because it only happens during the initial state. So now I can see that inner width is 428. I can set state in componentWillMount hook. And another important thing to notice is this is the only hook that executes on server rendering. And we're not going to cover it over here, but just to let you know. The next hook it would run is render. So, which we already have. Every component should have a render method. So let's just, here, if I'm going to console log render here, and if I save it, in the console log I can see constructor, then componentWillMount, and then render method happens. Now when render happens, it's basically rendering the component. So basically it takes the state and the props and renders our component. So what should not be done in render? I would suggest not to call the set state in render. But let's say if you could do it, then as soon as you do that, you would get another render, right? Because render is a method that called every time you change the state or prop. Don't set the state in render. And also another important thing to notice is, let's say your component have a child component, and it can have its own children and a tree of components, right? So when you do a render, it would go through the cycle of building each subcomponent, and each child component basically would go through constructor, componentWillMount, render, and from top to bottom all the way before your parent component finishes rendering. So that brings to our next hook called componentDidMount, which means before render it was componentWillMount, and after render it's componentDidMount, which means it has already rendered. componentDidMount, and I can simply console log it here. All right, and let's look at it. So as we can see, constructor, componentWillMount, render, and componentDidMount. Now, important thing to notice is, since this component doesn't have any children, if we add a children, then we should be able to see how the children gets rendered. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another component, a new file. I'm just going to say child.js. Copy everything that I've done here. We're going to call it child, and constructor, we're not going to have state here. We're just going to say child constructor, and we're not going to do this here. We're just going to say child componentWillMount, child componentDidMount, child render. We are not going to do anything else here, and then in the end we can export the child. Now in the app.js we need to import the child, import child from child, and in here I can have child, and I can also pass some prop called name equal to this dot state dot name. Inside the child, we can say name this dot props dot name. Okay, so now let's see what it renders. All right, so now you can see that it's rendering the child. And if you look at the chronology now, so first the app components constructor runs, then app components constructor componentWillMount runs, and then render. And then it doesn't run the componentDidMount, but instead it would run child's constructor, child's componentWillMount, child's render, and then child's componentDidMount, and then the app componentDidMount. So the componentDidMount, actually, if you have a hierarchy of component, the last one would run first, and then it would go up the chain, and the app components componentDidMount run in the end. Because when you render a component, you need to render everything else before you can say I finished rendering, right? Basically, I'm completely mounted. So componentDidMount also only runs once, and only runs during the initial cycle. So what can you do in componentDidMount? You can make, actually, if you want to make an AJAX call, you can make an AJAX call here. This is the right place to do. This is also a good place to set up any subscriptions if you want to, but make sure that you unsubscribe when there is a method called componentDidUnmounting, when the component dies. So make sure that you clean it up. You could actually call setState in componentDidMount, but when you do that, it would basically re-render the component. Okay, so these are the methods, hooks for the initial rendering. Now let's look at what happens if you change the state when the component re-renders. What are the ways to re-render component? When you change a state, it should re-render. When you change a prop, it should re-render. Or you can specifically call force update method, basically saying I don't really care, just re-render, and these situation it should re-render. So let's try to re-render. So basically we can start with the change state. So in the app, what I can do is I can have a button and I can say change, and inside the button I can have a on click event, and when this runs I can simply run change state event, which we haven't written. So I'm just gonna write here change state, and all it's gonna do here is this dot set state, and it's gonna change the name to, let's say, Jill. Okay, here I have to say mind this, and now if I click on it, when I change the state, it only runs render. So we haven't put any other hooks right now when it re-renders. The only hooks running is a render and then child render. So let's look at the hooks when you re-render your component. So the first hook is called componentWillReceiveProps. Let's console log it to see when does this happen. And I can do the same in the child. Here I'm just going to say child componentWillReceiveProp. So here the child will receive pop runs, but the main component somehow doesn't run. I'm assuming that is because I don't have any props in the main components. So what can we do here in the componentWillReceiveProps? We will have a glimpse of upcoming state and the prop, right? Because either you're changing a state or you're changing a prop. You could set state here if you want to. But let's say if your change is triggered because of another set state, it should be ignored because it doesn't make sense. And definitely don't try to change any props in this method. So that's the main important thing to notice. All right, so the next hook is shouldComponentUpdate. It sounds more like a question. Let's say if you want to make a decision that you want to re-render it or not. You can make that decision here based on whatever logic that you want to make a decision on. And so this method actually has, you have to return something. If you return true, which means it will go through the rendering. If you return false, then the re-rendering would stop here. It should not further. And you would also have argument here. It would have your next prop and next state here. So you can use those to make your decision. I should console log here. And I should have the same method in child. I should say child here because it's a child. All right, so if I run this, should component update and should child. Now let's say if I do false for child, so instead of true, if I say false, then let's see what happens. So after the initial state, if I click on here, it basically stops the re-rendering of it. So that's why you would see in the outer, the name is Jill, but inside I have still the old name, which is John, because I stopped the re-rendering of the child component. If I say true, then I would see both Jill. So initially it's John here and here. And if I change the state, now I see Jill in both places. Also, another important thing to notice is that let's say if you're changing a state or prop, this method should run and you can make a decision if you want to continue with the update or not. But if it's happening because of the force update method, which means you're really forcing it to update, then this method will not even run, because if you're forcing it, there is no need to make a decision, right? Because you already made a decision to force update it. So, all right, so the next method is, I know there are lots of methods called componentWillUpdate. All right, so, and I can also, all right, so after the initial run, if I change the state, then after shouldComponentUpdate, componentWillUpdate runs. The same thing for the child, componentWillUpdate. What's the significance of this method, componentWillUpdate? This is similar to componentWillMount when you do an initial render. Basically, if you want to set some variables based on the state and props, you can do it because you have state and prop available. What you should not do is run the set state here, because if you do that, then there will be another componentWillUpdate, and it will take you in an infinite loop. So don't do set state here. So after the initial state, when I change the state, as you can see, it componentWillUpdate and then it renders. Here also componentWillUpdate and it renders. So render happens after that. Right after that, you will have componentDidUpdate. So let's do that one. So instead of will, I have componentDidUpdate. And componentDidUpdate has previous props and previous state available. So what is the significance of this method, componentDidUpdate? So let's say if you want to set up some third-party UI elements, you can do that here. Okay, so now we have looked at the initial render and the re-render cycle. Now let's look at it unmounted. So when a component dies, there's one method that runs. It's called componentWillUnmount. componentWillUnmount. So I can just console log it here. And the same thing I can do for child. First of all, what do you do when you unmount it? If you have done something when you have mounted, you can undo that when you unmount it. So you can do a lot of cleaning up. There is no componentDidUnmount, because once it unmounted, you don't have any, because it's gone, the component is gone. So there is no method called didUnmount. So this is the only method. Now, how do you really test the unmount? What I'm gonna do is something strange. I can add a button here, and on click equal to, it would basically unmount child. So it's going to say unmount child. So how should we unmount this child? So here I can write this method unmount child. So just for sake of this example, what I can do is when I click on it, it should render completely just an empty div for this component. So there won't be any child left. So what I can say, and this can be done by setting some state. So let's say if I set a state, name, let's say equal to Robert. So when I set state to Robert, I should check here. If it's Robert, then instead of rendering the child element, it should just render empty div. So here I can say if this dot state dot name, let's say equal to Robert, then return an empty div. All right, else it should return whatever it's returning. Okay, and so when I do that, it should unmount it. So let's look at it. So this is the initial mount. I close it. Now if I click on the unmount, the component is gone, the child component. And as you can see here, the child's componentWillUnmount method runs. So this is how you unmount. All right, so I hope you learned something from this tutorial. And if you did, you can help me by liking the video, providing a nice comment, and or you can support the channel on Patreon. I'll provide a link here, or you can translate this video for me. I'll provide a link in the description. And thank you.